Good evening, everyone, or good afternoon, depending on where you are. Welcome to the first in a 5-part series of webinars being offered by Tanenbaum and Teaching Tolerance. I want to thank all of you for making the time to be with us today. I especially want to thank our partners at Teaching Tolerance for all the work that we've been doing together and the shared collaboration. And also just to give you a first note that on the bottom of our first slide, you see two sets of numbers for answering technical questions. So if you're having any technical questions and need help from the WebEx support desk, the numbers are listed there. And we can go to the next slide. So as you can see, I am the talking head you've been listening to for the last few seconds. I'm Mark Fowler, Managing Director of Programs at Tannenbaum. It's a pleasure to be with all of you today. And I'd like to introduce my colleague, Marcy Denberg-Sarah, who's the Education Program Associate here at Tannenbaum, and also is our coordinator for the day.
Hello, everyone. I'm excited to be with you here today to discuss legal considerations for fostering respect for religious diversity in the classroom. As Mark mentioned, I'll be handling the technology for our webinar today, and we'll keep us on schedule. You are all actually muted right now, and that's on purpose because we have a large number of participants. So if you can't speak into the webinar, that's okay. Additionally, I'd like to introduce you to our colleague at Teaching Tolerance, Sarah Wicht, who will also be presenting today.
Thank you, Marcy and Mark, and good afternoon to our virtual community. Thank you to all of you for joining Religious Diversity in the Classroom. What's law got to do with it?
Okay.
All right, so why don't we go to the next slide. Briefly, let me just tell everyone a little bit about Tannenbaum. We are a secular, non-sectarian, not-for-profit based in New York City, and our mission is to combat religious prejudice. And as you can see from the slide, we have 4 main program focus areas, one in workplaces where we work with Fortune 500 companies and large organizations to create inclusive environments, often working with diversity and inclusion professionals as well as human resource professionals. We have a conflict resolution program where we study the work of religious peacemakers, activists who are religiously motivated to end violence in active conflict zones around the world. We have a healthcare program where we focus on training medical practitioners in how to respectfully engage with patients and families about the decision-making that results from religious beliefs and practices. And in our education program, we're very pleased to be sharing with you today the 2 basic tenets and 2 basic areas in which we work. One, for educators to have the tools to address religion and religious diversity in their classroom content, and also in terms of creating an inclusive learning environment that fosters the kind of respect that would encourage learning about differences, including religious differences. So we're very glad to be with you today. And Sarah, why don't you tell everyone a little bit more about Teaching Tolerance?
Certainly. Thank you, Mark. So to our participants, you may know that Tannenbaum is located in the northeast, and Teaching Tolerance is located in the southeast. So thanks to virtual learning environments, we're able to be in different locations of the country and collaborate and present information to educators across the country. Teaching Tolerance was founded in 1991 by the Southern Poverty Law Center, and we are dedicated to reducing prejudice, improving intergroup relations, and supporting equitable school experiences for our nation's children. We work to provide materials that foster inclusive school environments and nurturing classrooms where equality and justice are not just taught but lived. And we are one of the nation's leading providers of anti-bias education resources. We reach hundreds of thousands of educators and millions of students annually via a magazine and online community of lessons and teacher resources. So let's look at the essential questions for the series. As mentioned at the beginning, this is the first in a series of 5 webinars that address religious diversity in the classroom. Teaching Tolerance and Tannenbaum have partnered to create this series And the guiding questions that will frame the content over the next 5 webinars are, why is it important to include religious diversity in classroom content? And what preparation do teachers need in order to address religion and religious diversity in classroom content? The 4 sessions after this legal issues webinar will cover classroom culture and grade-specific sessions for elementary, middle, and high school classrooms. We will share more information about the second in this series later today. For our time together this afternoon, we would like to focus on these 2 essential questions. How can legal guidelines inform my instructional choices about discussing religious diversity in the classroom, and how does freedom of expression foster civic engagement and a respectful and open learning environment? Keep these 2 questions in mind as we work for the next 55 minutes about. And I will give you back to Mark.
Sure. So we want to talk a little bit, give you a sense of, what our goals are for today. One is that at Tannenbaum, we pretty much operate under the idea that it's not necessarily about if you're going to address religious diversity in all of the areas in which we work, but it really is much more a matter of when and how you're going to be doing that. So we're definitely going to share with you first some data that helps to shape the rationale for why it's so important to teach about religion. Through the review of the legal guidelines and reviewing the First Amendment, our intention really is to talk very specifically about when and where it's most appropriate to include discussions of religion and religious diversity. And then finally, we want to be able to give you some guidance on the instructional choices that you're already making and possibly in your lesson planning, and give you a sense of what might be permissible that's in line with the Constitution and the First Amendment. And at Tannenbaum, we talk about better practices, because what's best practiced in one school may not necessarily be a great answer for another school. So in terms of better practices that we want to share with you today have a lot to do with addressing the concerns that come up with students, but also addressing concerns from parents and from administrators as well. So we're going to go on and just share with you some considerations to bear in mind as we go through the webinar. First, the purpose of this webinar really is to provide education and information on how you might address religious diversity in classroom content, but what we're presenting should not be considered legal advice. The information that we're going to provide during this webinar is not really going to be able to supply all of the answers to every question that there is concerning religion in schools. And this webinar was designed as an introductory level session that we could make available for educators in all grades and subjects and address concerns primarily that many public school teachers face. But we do believe that the information that we're going to share is completely applicable to the independent school environment as well as to the parochial environment. If you're looking for additional information specifically on how the legal guidelines can be interpreted, we have a lot of information that's in the after session pack that'll be available after the webinar completes. And then also, we do advise everyone for the most current information, particularly in the context that you're in, on determining what's permissible in your school setting to check with your local school administration or district. And at this point, I'm going to pass it over to Marcy, who's got some instructions for us.
Sure. I wanted to remind everybody that the session tonight and today is recorded and will be available following this webinar for you to be able to download. When you download the recording, you'll be able to view everything that took place in this webinar, including the PowerPoint and some of the polling. We ask that you participate today and have fun. Be sure to use the materials that will be sent in that after session pack, as our webinar was created with the utility of those materials in mind. a lot of items today will require input from you. We'll be utilizing the whiteboard and poll features of the webinar to gauge your responses. We'll let you know when it's either time to take a poll or type in your responses. And a note about your screen's view. If you're new to WebEx, we encourage you to not use the full screen view. If you are familiar with WebEx and have used it many times previously, and you wish to do so, feel free to use the full screen view by clicking on the icon in the lower left-hand corner of your screen. Again, if you're new to WebEx, stay out of full screen. For those of you using regular view, you can see that we have a chat window in the right panel where you can chat with me directly. As we get further along in the webinar, we will bring up a poll feature. And when it is time, this will appear below the chat window. Please note, we won't have a formal Q&A session due to the large number of participants here today. Toward the end of the webinar, we will designate time for respondents to type in their questions into the chat feature. However, feel free to put in your questions in the chat feature as they occur to you. We will respond to a selection of questions via blogs over the next week or so. More information about that will be shared via email. And today we'll be utilizing the whiteboard feature, a really fun feature of WebEx. In the next slide, we're going to run a test. This is what the whiteboard menu looks like. You have the cursor, which you can utilize by clicking on the T. And we ask that you change your color to a darker color so everyone can see your responses. I'm going to bring up the next blank whiteboard slide, and we want you to practice using the whiteboard by typing in the word test into the screen. If you prefer not to use the whiteboard, going forward, you can simply chat to me directly. We'll make sure your responses are heard. So we see people typing in tests slowly but surely. Make sure to change your colors. And make sure you're using the T for your cursor, not the paintbrush. The T, not the paintbrush. Good. So some people are still using the paintbrush. That's okay. But please click on the T because the paintbrush gives us font that's too big for us to be able to use.
And let me just say one word. So we currently have a little over 100 participants. And if we all wrote on the whiteboard at the same time, then we won't necessarily be able to really see what everyone is sharing. So we really do encourage you to toggle back and forth, use the whiteboard in some instances, and then chat your answers in other instances so everyone kind of gets a chance so we can see so we can really share in this community.
And somebody wrote 10 tests. Thank you. Okay. We're going to go back.
Okay, so we'll be doing some check-ins throughout the webinar. As you can see, we have done our webinar welcome and introduction. We'll shortly be going through our rationale. We're going to do an overview of the First Amendment. We have a case study that we've pulled from actually an actual experience and work with that with some extensions and look at it from the perspective of First Amendment implications. And then there'll be an opportunity towards the end for you to do a self-assessment, and we'll give you some concluding thoughts. So let's get started. And as you can see, a key factor that leads to addressing religious diversity, certainly in the United States, and for those of you who may be joining us from other countries as well, is immigration. And for the purposes of this webinar, we're looking at these statistics that come from the U.S. Census and the American Community Survey, which is a report generated from the U.S. Census. And we're talking, when we say the word foreign-born, we're referring to someone who was born in a country other than the one in which they reside. And as you can see from these statistics, in 1970, what you can't see clearly on the screen is that only about 4.7% of the United States population was foreign-born. The vast majority, which you can see, came from Europe and were white and Christian, and bringing with them more familiar cultural and religious practices. We fast forward to 2010, the foreign-born population in the United States has nearly tripled to about 12.5%, but now only 12.7% of those coming to the United States are coming from Europe. The majority now are coming, of foreign-born residents are coming from Latin America, coming from Asia, and in this survey, Asia also encompasses the Middle East, as well as Africa, Oceania. And that means that there are increasingly less well-known cultures and traditions, as well as practices within traditions that are present in the country as well as in our schools. And if you will, we have to kind of ask ourselves the question, how literate are we about all of this diversity and all of these differences? Which actually is going to take us into our first opportunity to share with each other in terms of a whiteboard. We'd like for everyone to, a whiteboard and the chat feature, for everyone to describe briefly what your definition of religious literacy is. So Marcy, you can take it away from there.
Sure. So similar to what we did before in our test, we're going to ask that you click on the cursor, which is a T, change the color to a dark color, and type in your definition of religious literacy. Once you hit that, put in that definition, hit the return or enter button on your keyboard and click anywhere outside of that space. Feel free to use the chat too.
So some of the themes that we see that are similar so far have to do with understanding, have to do with knowledge and increasing knowledge, the impact of religion on our society.
And I'm going to copy some of what I'm getting in the chat for you to see in the chat as well.
Seems that many people are typing in the same place, which actually adds to kind of a layering. So you might want to find another place to maybe copy and paste your response. And understanding that we're not the same, that we don't necessarily believe in the same way. Being able to understand different religions. Understanding and accepting religious diversity and appreciating that role in one's life and in one's society, one's community. Understanding of others' views on religion. Some thoughts about doctrine. Great.
Okay.
So why don't we switch back? You want to share some things from the chat box?
Sure. I've actually shared them publicly, but I can share them verbally as well.
Yeah, just a couple.
A couple that we got were being able to recognize the major tenets and the many views and ways in which people around the world seek to connect to the divine, to divine knowledge and respect for beliefs and practices of other religions as well as one's own. Not always to understand all religions, but to acknowledge that that different groups have different beliefs. To me, religious diversity means to not only understand the various religions, but to embrace them and respect them.
That's really great. Why don't we go back to our slide deck, because we'd actually like to share now, I think a working definition that encompasses a lot of what everyone has shared both in the chat and on the whiteboard. So this definition comes from the American Academy of Religions, who created guidelines for teaching about religions that were released in 2010, and they are part of your after session pack. And they identified religious literacy as a basic understanding about the role religion plays in history, politics, social and cultural structures, the diversity within religions, which is a huge topic, as well as the basic facts of the world's religions. But when we talk about religious literacy, we also have to look at the other side of the coin and talk about, well, what constitutes religious illiteracy? And as you can see, we're talking about now a lack of understanding. So if we're talking about, for instance, the basic tenets of the world's tradition, do students, for instance, know that the Dalai Lama is Buddhist? If we're talking about the diversity of expressions and beliefs within traditions, are students aware that if you look at Christianity, and depending on the source that you look at, you could be looking at either 4,500 denominations of Christianity or over 40,000 denominations of Christianity worldwide. And when we're talking about the role that religion plays in the various parts of human engagement, if we think about global conflicts that are going on currently and those that have been named as having religion as a source, is it actually religion, or is it an argument over resources, and religion is becoming a tool where people are being pitted one against another? That's often what many of our peacemakers report in their work. And to take it a step further, Dr. James Banks, who's a member of our Program Advisory Council, had this to say about the idea of cultivating global citizens, that the world's greatest problems do not result from people being unable to read and write. They actually result from people in the world, from different cultures, races, religions, and nations, being unable to get along and to work together to solve the world's intractable problems. So when we're talking about skill sets that we want young people to have, and how do we want to prepare them for life, we know that the Common Core, part of it has to do with having students be college ready and having them be career ready. But I think what we're pointing to in this webinar is also having students be world ready and have students be ready to engage a 21st century global economy where they will be working with colleagues in various parts of the world far more frequently in the future than they will now. And then that kind of gets us into this conversation of, well, what gets in the way? What gets in the way of providing this kind of education for young people? And we've been able to identify what we call barriers to curiosity. And this is something that we see across all of the program areas that we work in. And, you know, we all have some curiosity, and we have curiosity about religion and traditions and non-beliefs, et cetera. But there are sometimes things that get in the way, and we can bring that animation up now, that there are a variety of ways in which that curiosity that we have about our differences that pertain to religion prevent us from moving forward. You know, we may be concerned about projecting our own beliefs on students, or we may be concerned about being offended or offending others, or not feeling like we have enough knowledge or information to really engage with the topic. And all of these are perfectly natural. But I think that what we want to do is find ways and train ourselves to be able to move beyond our barriers towards addressing this topic. We are hoping, but all of us at both Teaching Tolerance and Tannenbaum, that this kind of session is the start and it can be a part of that moving beyond that barrier. And Sarah, why don't I turn it over to you now?
Great, thanks, Mark. Yeah, as we're really what we're talking about right now is that rationale for addressing religious diversity and specifically in the classroom. And in addition to those barriers of curiosity, I think there's a big part of us that doesn't know what we don't know. And it's easy to fall into the don't know, kind of don't worry about it. But the fact is, ignorance really isn't bliss. Much of the work that we've done collectively as educators and our two organizations is working really to reduce prejudice, and we've leaned a lot on context theory and other pedagogical approaches over the years, and what we're learning is that further work to change injustices is necessary, and the statistics here that we are sharing with you today really conclude our rationale for being together. According to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, hate crime victimization report. The percentage of hate crimes motivated by religious bias was nearly 3 times higher in 2012 than in 2004. In 2012, 1 in 5 violent hate crime offenders were under the age of 17, and this is a decrease from 2004. That decrease reinforces the importance of the work that we do in schools and communities, especially with our youth. And there is still a pressing need to combat bias within this age group. Our work is moving in the right direction, but there is still a lot that we can do to equip ourselves to continue to do this work in the arena of social justice. For example, in 2013, the Southern Poverty Law Center identified 939 active hate groups in the United States. If we look at the definition of hate crimes, these are crimes that manifest evidence of prejudice based on race, gender, or gender identity, religion, disability, sexual orientation, or ethnicity. And hate crime victimization refers to a single victim or household that experienced a criminal incident believed by the victim to be motivated by hate. We want to continue to reduce the number of hate crimes and hate groups in the United States, and in order to do that, we believe that prejudice reduction work must extend to understanding injustice and then doing something about changing existing injustices. This includes religion in the classroom. So including religion in our instruction allows students to examine diversity in a social, cultural, a political, and historical context, rather than in ways that are superficial or oversimplified. And this also gives students to build their own abilities to recognize how power and privilege influence relationships in an interpersonal as well as an intrapersonal way and all social development. So this is really, if we want to do, we could do another agenda check here, looking at why is it important. Today we're looking at the parameters, the legal parameters, but we also really want to reinforce and stress that there is a rationale for the importance of including religious diversity. So I think we're ready to move on to our first true-false quiz.
You are right, Sarah. I mean, this would not really be a training for teachers and educators if we didn't have a test of some kind. So we have actually 4 true-false statements that we're going to go through, and all of them are framed from the perspective of what's permissible in a public school. So why don't we bring up the first one? I can read the Bible with my class. So you'll note that the poll features on the right-hand side of your screen, and we're going to open the poll and give you an opportunity to vote yes or no. I can read the Bible with my class, and you can begin voting now. And so just so you know, as you're voting, when we close the poll, it takes about 15 seconds or so to actually upload the results. So we are going to, I think we'll close the poll now. And in a few seconds, we'll be able to share the results with you. And every now and again, you may hear some sounds from New York City. Okay, now we're showing the results. So you can see it, about 20, Marcy, you can see it better than I can.
Sure. We have about 27% of us stated true. I can read the Bible with my class. About 40% of us stated false, and 32 did not have a chance to answer. So is it true or false? Let's see.
It's actually true. And the prevailing idea with this is that context makes makes all of this possible, and the manner in which the Bible is being used in the classroom makes all the difference. So we can bring some examples up that it makes sense. Certainly, you could use the Bible or any other sacred text as either a piece of literature, studying it from a literary perspective, or even talking about that sacred text's influence on other works. But what you can't do is actually read the Bible with students with the intention to either share your beliefs with them or to try and challenge students' beliefs about the Bible or anything else. So we just want to be mindful of what's the context of the way in which you're using either the Bible or any other sacred text. So now we have our second true-false statement. When asked by a high school student, I can pray with him or her. So we're going to open the poll and give you an opportunity to vote. And you can vote now. Okay, so we're going to close the poll now. And shortly we'll be able to share these results with you.
Thirty-seven percent of us said true when asked by a high school student, I can pray with him or her. 41% said false, and 22% did not answer. So is this true or false?
So it's very, very close and very interesting that the numbers are so close. But this is actually false. We can go to the next slide and let's bring up our example. So it's certainly permissible for students to engage in private prayer during the school day. But it's not permissible or advisable for teachers to pray with students. And here's why. Particularly when we're talking about public school teachers are actually considered agents of the state. And by praying with students in school, you may be violating the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment. And we'll talk more about that in some detail in a bit. I think it's also important to note, though, that we recognize that teachers and administrators, like students, bring their faith with them into the school as well. So because of the First Amendment, school officials or people who are representing the school who wish to pray during the day can do so, but it needs to be outside of the presence of students. And one of the things that I think we have to bear in mind is that there is a power dynamic relationship between teacher and student or administrator and student, and we don't necessarily want to blur that relationship or inadvertently engage in an activity where a student may feel that they have to engage in an activity. So why don't we go to the next true-false statement. I can require a moment of silence in my classroom at the beginning of the day. So we're going to open that poll. I can require a moment of silence in my classroom at the beginning of the day. Okay, we're going to close the poll now. It gives us about a 20-second delay before we can upload and share the poll results with everyone. Unfortunately, we don't have any musical interlude. Okay, here come those results. So what do we have, Marcy?
59% of us said true. I can require a moment of silence in my classroom at the beginning of the day. 14% of us said false. 27% did not answer. Is it true or is it false?
Okay, well, let's go on to the next slide. And it actually is indeed false. And here's the thing. The trick with that statement was the word require. So school officials can't require a moment of silence at school for any reason. Now, if you create one, there certainly can be time for quiet reflection, but students actually do have the freedom to use that time and reflect in whatever way that they see fit. That quiet time can't really be used to coerce or to show preference or promote religion in general in any kind of way, or even no religion or a particular belief system. And something also interesting to note is that students can't be forced to recite the Pledge of Allegiance by school officials. So it's an opportunity within the school day, but students do have the right to not participate in that particular activity. This is actually guided by two statutes, one in 1985 and one in 1943, Virginia State Board of Education versus Barnett, is what took place in 1943, particularly addressing the Pledge of Allegiance. Now, why don't we go to our last true-false statement?
Sure.
So if my student gives an oral report on Muhammad, I have to stop him. So we'll open the poll. It's open. If my student gives an oral report on Muhammad, I have to stop him. Okay, and why don't we close that poll? Okay, and we should be able to show the results now.
Okay, so for those of us who answered true, 3%, if my student gives an oral report on Muhammad, I have to stop him. 3% said true. 73% said false. 24% no answer.
Okay, and it is indeed false. You do not have to stop a student who wants to do a report on Muhammad, provided that that report meets the criteria of the assignment, and it's perfectly acceptable. And this is the case for any historical religious figure, that you don't have to stop the oral report, but what we want to be mindful of is, does the report or does the work itself seek in any way to indoctrinate other students or to be coercive? That you do want to stop. And if we go to the next slide,
my apologies.
Yeah, we can just go back for a second. I think it's important for us to bear in mind that we definitely are asked often in all of our work about coercion and proselytizing, et cetera, and we will say a word about that a little bit later. But I think what's most important to take away from these true-false statements is that context really does mean everything, and the way in which either students are interacting with the topic of religion or the ways in which, as educators, we're interacting with students around religion and religious diversity, the context in which we do that is really decisive. So why don't we go to this discussion? We want to start this discussion about the First Amendment. And we want to review some of the key legal items that affect religion being addressed in the school setting, and we'll particularly, of course, be talking about the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause.
Okay.
Okay, great. So the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause are often referred to as the Constitution's religion clauses, and they're the first 16 words of the First Amendment. And we're going to give an example of what each clause entails, but we also know that it can sometimes feel complicated to understand, because if each of these clauses were implemented to their extremes, they would actually begin to contradict one another. So the U.S. Supreme Court has really issued a number of tests that help to strike a balance between these two clauses. So let's take a look at the Establishment Clause. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. And fundamentally, this first section prevents the government from establishing an official religion, but it also prohibits government actions that would favor one religion over another. So it prohibits the government from preferring religion over non-religion or non-religion over religion. First Amendment was an addition to the original Constitution. And so when the Bill of Rights was developed, the Founding Fathers enshrined religion in the First Amendment to secure this newfound freedom of religion. And when we look specifically in schools, let's go to the next slide.
Actually, I'm getting a couple of reports that people aren't able to see the slide.
Oh, okay.
So right now, the top of the slide says the Establishment Clause in red. And the very first line below that says, in schools, this generally means. Okay, I'm getting responses that people can now see it. Is anybody out there having trouble seeing it?
If you're having trouble seeing the slide, just type it into the chat box.
Okay, people are now reporting that they can see it.
Okay, and we're not completely sure what happened.
Okay.
Well, I'm glad that we're all back. So when we talk about the Establishment Clause, particularly in the school setting, the prevailing idea that when you're addressing religion, that the school must remain neutral toward religion, not ignore religion. And I think that that's a big distinction. But you have to remain neutral in the presentation of the information, nor would you seek to try and endorse one religion over another. So you see examples here of ways in which that shows up in the school, not mandating or organizing prayer at school functions. Teachers you can't teach religion from the perspective of indoctrination, but you can certainly teach about religion, its impact on the evolution of society from a secular and neutral perspective. Schools can't observe religious holidays, and here's the thing. There's a difference between closing the school building because you are religiously observing, let's say, Passover. There's a difference between that and closing the school building because either a large percentage of your workforce will not be able to come in that day because they are observing, or because a large percentage of your student population will not be able to come in. And in the United States, that often has to do with students who might identify as Christian. So when we talk about schools can't observe religious holidays, that's what we mean. Schools can't erect religious symbols. Public schools we're talking about now, to be very clear. And then school officials can't distribute religious literature for personal reasons. But again, if you're using a sacred text as part of the study or for the purpose of study of literature or for academic purposes, that's completely fine. So let's go to the Free Exercise Clause, prohibiting the free exercise thereof. So fundamentally, what this refers to is that the Free Exercise Clause prohibits government from enacting laws that specifically target any religion. It allows the government to provide houses of worship with some special accommodations and exemptions from civil law that might otherwise interfere with religious worship or practice. But that also means that government cannot pass a law that would have the effect of interrupting the practice of religious faith. So it would be, for example, unconstitutional if government created a law that did not allow people to go to their preferred house of worship. Then one other point about that is that there are the clauses are always up to interpretation and seeing how far they can go and what some of their limits are, what the limits of the interpretation is. So we want to be mindful that this is a dynamic process. This is not one that, if you will, written in stone, but it is one that we want to be mindful of and be able to get some facility with in terms of what our limits are as educators. And I think we have more space sometimes than we know. So we've finished our overview of the First Amendment, and I think let's jump right into our case study, which we're going to look at from the perspective of First Amendment considerations. So in our case study, we have a teacher, Ms. Miller, who teaches a 7th grade class at a public middle school She has asked her students to present an oral report about someone they look up to. 1 week before the presentations, each student shares with the class a bit about who they chose. One student named Jamie explains that she chose to speak about God. The teacher tells Jamie that she cannot present this report and that she should speak about someone else. Jamie shares this news with her parents, and Jamie's parents become upset and contact the school officials. And this case was actually adapted from a recent article that the First Amendment commented on, First Amendment Center, commented on. So we'd like to give you an opportunity to use the whiteboard feature and the chat again. Marcy, why don't you take it away?
Sure. So we're going to use the whiteboard now to remark on what we think the school officials should do. And just to recap real quick, Jamie wants to give her report on God. The teacher asks that Jamie choose somebody else, and that Jamie's parents become upset and contact the school. We want to know what you think the school officials should do. You can either type in your responses using the whiteboard, which we just pulled up, or you can use the chat, and I'll make sure to copy many of your responses to all participants. Again, we're going to use the T and change your color to a darker color.
Okay, thank you for the responses that you're bringing up. So we see ideas like giving the students the context about how they can frame their report, being mindful that if indoctrination is not present, then it should be fine, setting clear guidelines, which is really important, not just when addressing religion, but when addressing any kind of topic. What are the clear guidelines for students to operate within? And Marcy, are there things in the chat you'd like to share?
Sure, and I've been sending it along. The teacher should have made the instructions more clear, historic figure, and not actually someone. The student should be allowed to do her report on whomever she chooses. It is her viewpoint and not that of the school. The premise is that God is a person. The assignment might have asked for a person. The school should allow her to construct the paper, however, it must meet the criteria.
This is all really great. Thank you so much for sharing all of this in the community. I think if we go on, because there are a couple of extensions we want to do as well. But fundamentally, what happened in this case, what actually happened is that, as many of you suggested, the school district immediately recognized that the teacher had made the wrong decision. They met with the family, the school apologized, and acknowledged that Jamie had the right to write about God. And in particular, something to bear in mind in terms of U.S. Department of Education guidelines, students can express their beliefs about religion in the form of homework, artwork, or any other written and oral assignments that's free of discrimination based on the religious content of their submission. So as long as these guidelines are being met, then Jamie was fine. And this, if you will, becomes an example of being mindful of teaching about religions or introducing religions in a neutral and relevant manner. And it becomes an opportunity as well within the classroom to foster the kind of respect for religious diversity as an academic subject and academic exercise as we've been talking about. But let's add an extension to this. So let's say that the teacher originally allowed Jamie to do her report on God. But another student's parents, Shannon's parents, learn about this report that Jamie is going to do. And Shannon's mom asks for her child to be excused from class because the presentation infringes upon her religion, upon her belief. And we want to use the poll feature now and just to see, what do you think? Should the teacher allow Shannon to be excused from the class? So the poll is open. And so what do you think? Should the teacher allow Shannon's excusal? Should Shannon be allowed to be excused from the class?
And I'm going to close the poll.
Let's give it just, oh, well, it's closed. All right, that's fine. Just a few more seconds.
Okay. So what should the teacher do? Should she allow the excusal? 49% of us said yes, the teacher should allow the excusal. 17% of us said no. 33% did not answer.
Okay, and pretty much the prevailing idea is that you could allow this excusal, and school officials should really look for, whenever possible, to try and accommodate the requests of parents and guardians and students for excusal for religious reasons, but there are some guidelines to bear in mind. So one is that this comes from the joint statement of current law on religion in the public schools. If it's proved that particular lessons substantially burden a student's free exercise of religion, and if the school cannot prove a compelling interest in requiring attendance, the school would be legally required to excuse the student. And a test, if you will, called the Sherber test allows us to look at this, unpack this a little bit more. If you're the person that has the claim about a sincerely held religious belief, in this example, Shannon's mother is asking for a child to be excused for religious reasons. And what you want to do first as the teacher or the administrator is ask if the request is based on a sincere religious belief. Now, you don't have to judge whether it's sincerely held, but you do need to ask. You don't have to agree with it, but you do need to ask, and only find out if it's sincere to the person. And then from the perspective of government action, the school officials have to determine whether or not reading the student assignment written about God would constitute a substantial burden on the student's religious liberty rights. And this is a little bit more difficult to determine, but in most cases, if the parent and student find that the report is deeply offensive to their religious beliefs, then making the student listen to the report would be a substantial burden. From the school perspective, if we're looking at public schools in particular, if there's a compelling interest in the education and welfare of children, that's the framework that we look for. But in this instance, the school clearly has a compelling interest in having students listen to oral reports as part of their educational development. But the last part of the test really requires that the school pursue that interest in a way that's least restrictive to the family that has the concern or the complaint. And so, if you will, this truncated version here lets you know that you want to provide, if you decide to excuse Shannon, then you want to provide meaning that she may not, there are going to be a number of other oral reports that she can listen to in the class. Nothing will necessarily be harmed if she doesn't hear Shannon's. And then whatever excusals come up, you don't want it to be a situation where the child who's excused is stigmatized or that the excusal comes across as punitive. And this actually leads us into just a quick note about proselytizing, because that can sometimes be parents' concerns that there may be beliefs that are shared that they don't want their children to know about, or that they may be coerced in some way. And in Tannenbaum, we distinguish proselytizing, if you will, between the dictionary definition, which you see on the screen, to our kind of expanded idea of proselytizing having more to do with inappropriate religious expression or the unsolicited sharing of beliefs or practices. And when this comes up in the classroom, there are a couple of things that we recommend. So one of them is to bear in mind that recognize the student's intention. So it may not be that the student is actually intending to try and be coercive. We want to be mindful of what those intentions are. We also want to review whatever classroom rules of respect or constructs that you have within your classroom. And we also want to provide analogies related to peer pressure, because if a student is actually experiencing proselytizing, we also want to make sure that there's no peer pressure going on. And this is also a really great opportunity to ask students to rephrase their statements, to actually find another way to ask a respectful question about something that they may not know.
And now I think we're going to be able to go into assessment.
Okay, so Sarah, let me turn it over to you.
Thank you, Mark, and my apologies for my loud pen that landed on the tabletop in the middle of your talking. We are wanting to move through now, just a quick check-in at the agenda. Let's think really about what you've heard so far through the case studies, through the true and false, through the information that we've shared to this point. And I want you to think about your practice. And I'm going to present 3 questions for you to respond to, and we'll use the poll feature. So we'll go through these kind of quickly. It's kind of your initial response. So you're answering this first one: very frequently, often, occasionally, seldom, or never. When discussing religion in the classroom, I link the content to an educational goal. You can enter your reply in the poll. About 10 more seconds, and Marcy will close the poll.
Sure. I'm going to close the poll.
Yep.
It takes a minute to upload.
As we're waiting for that to upload, and before we move on to the results of the next question, this is really getting at our thinking that our academic outcomes drive the choices that we make with our materials. So if we look at this question, we're looking at the why would I, really. It serves, is the answer to the why that it serves an academic goal or outcome, then it's linked to the content and an educational goal. And it looks like 31% of us are very frequently doing this, and the other numbers follow. Let's look at the next question. Again, very frequently, often, occasionally, seldom, or never. Think of your own practice. When discussing religion in the classroom, I present the information from a factual and neutral perspective. Go ahead and submit your response. And go ahead and close the poll. The results should be coming up, and while we wait for the results to show up, this question really gets at your teaching methods, the how you deliver the content. As Mark mentioned earlier, both direct and indirect influence educator on student is one that we can never be 100% sure of how much effect we're having on our students. We need to be very aware of that. It looks like 44% of us very frequently presenting from a factual and neutral perspective. And for our time together, one more self-assessment, same options, the poll is open. Thinking of your own practice, I take care not to favor religion over secularism, atheism, agnosticism, etc., and vice versa in my assignments and class content. Thinking of your practice, you can respond. I think we can go ahead and close this poll. And as we await for the results to appear on this one, this last one is really being mindful of that influence you have over your students, creating a welcoming and safe environment for all students, as well as creating or providing windows and mirrors for your students. There is a more extensive self-assessment that is provided in the after-session pack, a more comprehensive educator assessment, and we hope that you have the chance to take advantage of that self-assessment. We designed that specifically to help you think about those topics which were covered today.
Sarah?
Yes, we are at our limit.
Exactly. I was going to say maybe we should skip on to our wrap-up of the Enduring Understandings.
Let's go ahead.
All right. Okay. So, everyone, we see that our time is up, but I'm going to say that it's short. And say that as we talked about at the very beginning of the session, these are the enduring understandings that we wanted to bring forth in this session to have people have more of a sense about being able to teach about religion rather than teaching religion, and certainly that you can do so in a way that doesn't either promote or denigrate religion or faith or tradition. To have a little bit more of an understanding of why it's important to explore diverse religions from a citizenship perspective, and the concept of freedom of expression and how it relates to, I think, all of our goals around trying to create an inclusive environment around religious diversity. So after the webinar completes, you'll see there'll be a variety of resources in the after-session pack. We really encourage you to use those. The webinar has been recorded, so please feel free to share it with your colleagues. You'll be prompted after you sign out to an evaluation, and we would very much appreciate your feedback. We very much use it in the creation of our next series. Let it be in touch with us and let us know how we can support you in this area going forward. Contact information will be on the last slide. And stay tuned for our next session, which will be in August 20th and 21st, where we'll be talking more specifically about what to do in the classroom, really to create an inclusive learning environment. And finally, just our thanks for you being with us today. Marcy and Sarah's contact information is there. It'll be a part of the recorded webinar, so you'll be able to easily access us. And your evaluations will be coming up very soon. And Marcy, I think you had a couple of closing pieces of business.
Sure. So I wanted to let everybody know that if you would want to stay on the line and put more questions that you have for us in the chat window, we'll make sure to include those questions when we create content for our blog. When we hang up right now, or when you click out of the webinar, an evaluation will appear on your screen. We thank you ahead of time for filling that out. And I just wanted to say it was a pleasure to spend time with you today, and I'm sure Sarah from Teaching Tolerance has a couple of words to say as well.
I echo your appreciation for your attendance, or Marcy's appreciation for your attendance today. Take advantage of the materials that are in the after-session pack and let us know, please, if you have any questions or need any further support. And watch for webinars 2, 3, 4, and 5 in this series. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.